Right now, everything in your fridge is dying. Slowly, quietly, but dying. Milk turns in days. Bread molds in a week. Even meat in the freezer is on borrowed time. But somewhere in your kitchen cupboard, there's probably a food that is doing the exact opposite. If you sealed it up and forgot about it for the next 3,000 years, would still be safe to eat when someone finally opened it. That's not a guess. It's already happened. In 1922, when archaeologists cracked open a sealed Egyptian tomb, they found jars of it sitting beside a dead pharaoh, and it was still edible. Bread, meat, fruit, milk, every one of them rots. So how did this one substance figure out how to cheat death entirely? And why did nearly every ancient civilization on Earth treat it as something closer to magic than food? That story doesn't start with the Egyptians. It starts thousands of years earlier, on the side of a cliff, with someone risking their life for a taste of something sweet. Long before farming, before writing, before anyone had built a single permanent structure, humans were already climbing sheer rock faces for one reason: to steal from bees. We know this because of a cave painting in Spain, roughly 8,000 years old, showing a human figure clinging to a cliff wall, one hand reaching into a crack in the rock, the other holding a basket, while bees swarm around their head. This wasn't a one-off. Nearly identical rock art has turned up in Africa, India, and Australia, completely separate populations, with no contact with each other, independently deciding the same thing was worth the risk. And the risk was real. No protective suits, no smoke, just bare skin against hundreds of defensive stings, for a substance our ancestors couldn't get anywhere else in nature. Fruit was seasonal and mostly water. Roots took real work for the body to convert into usable energy. Honey was different. Pure, concentrated sugar, ready to use immediately, and it didn't spoil sitting in the hive. Some anthropologists even argue this mattered more than we realize. The human brain burns through roughly a fifth of the body's daily energy, despite being a fraction of its weight. And a food source dense enough to fuel that kind of organ, available across almost every climate on Earth, may have quietly shaped how our species evolved. Humans weren't even the only species that figured this out. In parts of Africa, a small bird called the greater honey guide developed a working relationship with humans that has lasted tens of thousands of years. It locates a wild hive, then deliberately leads a person to it with a specific call, waits while the human smokes out the bees, and takes the honey, and gets the leftover wax and larvae as payment. Nobody trained that bird. Evolution did. But climbing cliffs and following birds for scraps of wild honey only gets you so far. At some point, someone realized the smarter move wasn't hunting for honey, it was farming it. Around 4,500 years ago, Egyptian beekeepers did something nobody else had managed yet. They domesticated bees at scale. They built stacked cylindrical clay hives along the Nile, shaped to mimic the hollow logs and rock crevices bees already liked. And the bees simply moved in. Some beekeepers went further, loading hives onto barges and sailing them up and down the river, chasing the seasonal bloom of wildflowers, so their bees always had something fresh to work. This was organized commercial agriculture, over 2,000 years before Rome even existed as an empire. And in Egypt, honey wasn't just something you ate, it was currency. Some of the laborers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid partly in honey. It was medicine. Egyptian doctors mixed it into wound dressings with animal fat and plant fiber, and modern researchers testing these ancient recipes have found they actually worked. Surviving medical papyrus scrolls list honey as an ingredient in hundreds of separate remedies, for everything from eye infections to burns. And it was sacred. Honey was offered to the gods. The pharaoh's own official title included a phrase linking him directly to the bee. When a pharaoh died, honey went into the tomb with him, gold, jewels, and a jar of something sweet, because the Egyptians believed that whatever you brought into the afterlife needed to actually last. Out of everything they could have chosen, They picked the one substance that could survive as long as they needed it to. We'll get to exactly why that's chemically true later, because the science behind it is stranger than anything the Egyptians believed about their gods. Quick detour before we keep going, because this part is almost too specific to be believable. The ancient Greeks had priestesses at their most important religious site who were literally called the bees, and newborn Greek babies were anointed with honey right after birth. We'll get back to Greece properly in a second. By the time honey reached Greece, it wasn't just a food anymore. It was treated as proof of something divine. The Greeks called it the food of the gods and tied it to wisdom and immortality. Aristotle spent years personally observing beehives, trying to understand how they worked, in what may be one of the earliest serious attempts at biological study in recorded history. He got some of it wrong. He believed the queen bee was actually a king, but the fact that one of history's greatest minds chose bees as worth that kind of attention tells you how seriously the Greeks took this insect. Athletes at the ancient Olympics reportedly ate honey before competing, treating it as an energy source. Centuries before modern sports science would confirm that was a genuinely smart idea. And the physician Hippocrates, still considered the father of Western medicine, prescribed honey for wounds and ulcers, using descriptions that wound care specialists today would still mostly agree with. Then the Romans got hold of it, and true to form, they industrialized the entire operation. Wealthy Roman estates ran large-scale apiaries with hundreds of hives. Beekeeping became a respected, documented branch of agriculture. The poet Virgil devoted an entire book of his most famous work to describing bee colonies, comparing the hive to his idea of a perfect society. Roman soldiers carried honey on campaigns to preserve food on long marches, and it was the primary sweetener across the empire for the simple reason that refined sugar wouldn't exist in Europe for another 1,000 years. Here's the detail that should stick with you. Across every one of these civilizations, separated by centuries, oceans, languages, and completely different belief systems, one specific fact kept showing up. Nobody's honey ever went bad. Egyptian tomb jars, Greek storage vessels, Roman cellars. People built entire religious and economic systems around a substance they couldn't explain because it simply refused to follow the rules that governed every other food on the planet. It would take roughly 2,000 more years and the invention of modern chemistry before anyone actually understood why. Here's the reveal the whole video has been building toward. Honey doesn't survive by accident. It survives because it is, on a molecular level, one of the most hostile environments on Earth for anything trying to live inside it. First, water. Bacteria and mold need moisture to reproduce, and honey has almost none, under roughly 18% water content, well below the threshold most microorganisms need to survive. Bees achieve this by passing raw nectar, which starts around 80% water, from bee to bee, adding enzymes and fanning their wings until most of that moisture evaporates out. Second, acidity. Honey sits in a pH range close to vinegar or grapefruit juice, acidic enough that most bacteria, which prefer close to neutral conditions, simply can't function in it. Third, and this is the part that surprises almost everyone, bees add an enzyme called glucose oxidase from their own glands while making honey. That enzyme reacts with the glucose inside and produces, as a byproduct, small continuous amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Yes, the exact same antiseptic people pour on a cut. Honey is quietly manufacturing its own disinfectant, non-stop, for as long as it exists. And fourth, honey is hygroscopic. It actively pulls moisture out of anything that touches it. If a bacterium somehow lands on the surface, the honey draws the water directly out of that cell until it dehydrates and dies. Stack all four of those properties together: almost no water, high acid, self-generating antiseptic, and a surface that actively dries out anything that lands on it, and you get a food that is, chemically, nearly impossible for anything to grow inside of, as long as the seal stays intact. That is the entire secret. Not magic, not divine favor, just extremely aggressive chemistry, running quietly inside a jar for thousands of years. Modern medicine has actually circled back to this. Hospitals today use medical-grade honey, especially a variety called Manuka honey, from New Zealand, to treat wounds that regular antibiotics can't touch, including infections from antibiotic-resistant superbugs like MRSA. Decades of pharmaceutical research, and one of our best modern weapons against drug-resistant bacteria, is a substance bees have been making the same way for millions of years. Quick palate cleanser here, because the next part gets a little wild. Leave honey exposed to just enough moisture, a wet spoon, a humid kitchen, a lid left open, and that same sugar that refuses to rot can suddenly ferment instead. Wild yeast gets in, and the honey turns into mead, which may be older than both beer and wine, with pottery evidence from northern China dating back roughly 9,000 years. The Vikings built entire mythology around it, believing warriors in Valhalla drank endless mead for eternity, and the English word honeymoon likely comes from a medieval tradition of newlyweds drinking mead for an entire lunar month after their wedding to bring good fortune. But the people who actually kept beekeeping alive through Europe's darkest centuries were Christian monks. Monasteries maintained extensive hives, not mainly for the honey, but for the wax, which the church required for altar candles. That religious demand turned monasteries into the beekeeping centers of the Western world for nearly 1,000 years, and the honey itself became almost a side effect, used for cooking, for brewing mead to sell, and for continuing medical traditions that traced straight back to the Egyptians. For most of that history, beekeeping barely changed. Harvesting honey usually meant destroying the hive itself. It was wasteful, and everyone accepted it because nobody had found a better way. That changed in 1851, when an amateur naturalist in Philadelphia named Lorenzo Langstroth noticed something beekeepers had apparently overlooked for thousands of years. Bees consistently leave a gap of almost exactly 3/8 of an inch between honeycombs. Any narrower, and they seal it shut; any wider, and they fill it with extra comb. At that precise gap, they leave it open as a passage. Langstroth realized he could design a hive around that exact measurement. Removable wooden frames, spaced precisely 3/8 of an inch apart, letting beekeepers pull out individual combs, check for disease, and harvest honey without destroying the colony. He patented it in 1852, and that single design is still, in some form, the basis of nearly every commercial beehive operating today. One person measuring a gap between honeycombs turned beekeeping from a destructive, one-time harvest into a repeatable, scalable global industry. Here's the twist most people never hear about. In the autumn of 2006, beekeepers across the eastern United States started opening hives and finding them empty, not full of dead bees, just empty. The queen was still there. The honey was still there. The adult worker bees had simply vanished and never came back. Within a single season, some operations lost over 90% of their colonies. Scientists called it colony collapse disorder, and it turned out to be caused by several problems hitting bees simultaneously: parasitic mites, pesticide exposure, and the loss of diverse wildflowers bees need to stay healthy. Roughly 1 in 3 bites of food humans eat exists because of bee pollination, which is why this crisis matters far beyond honey jars on a grocery shelf. And there's a darker irony sitting right next to it. Independent lab testing has repeatedly found that a large share of honey sold internationally is cut with cheap corn or rice syrup, and some products labeled as honey contain almost no real honey at all. In 2013, U.S. federal investigators uncovered a scheme smuggling over $80 million worth of mislabeled honey into the country to dodge import tariffs. A substance that can survive completely untouched for 3,000 years inside a sealed tomb is now, in some cases, being faked with a jug of syrup and a misleading label. Every civilization that ever touched honey, cliffside foragers, Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Roman soldiers, medieval monks, was reacting to the exact same unexplainable fact. This substance simply refused to die, long before anyone had the chemistry to explain why. They didn't know about hydrogen peroxide or osmotic pressure. They just knew it lasted, and they treated it like it was something from beyond this world. You now know the actual chemistry behind something ancient civilizations worshipped as magic. And the next time you see a jar of honey sitting in your kitchen, you're looking at a substance that has been running the same immortal chemical trick for millions of years, long before pharaohs, long before pyramids, long before there was anyone around to notice. This is exactly why we started this channel. The food sitting in your kitchen right now has a history buried underneath it that almost nobody ever tells you.
If you want us to keep uncovering it, subscribe to Food Lore and tell us in the comments which everyday food you want us to dig into next.